All right, welcome back, everybody. Today is our second video in the series, the three-week series in the unit on St. Augustine's Confessions in the early church, one of the most important, if not the most important, non-biblical text in Christianity. In our first video, I simply presented the historical context, the first 500 years of Christianity, and then at the end of that video, I located Augustine's Confessions in that. So we talked about the age of the martyrs, we talked about Constantine, Theodosius I, making Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, Augustine's Confessions being written around the year 400, and then the Roman Empire collapsing about 76 years later. So today what we're going to do is I'm first going to talk a bit about Augustine in general, who he was, what his importance is for the history of Christianity. And of course, this entire book is an autobiography, and we'll talk about that, the complexity of that word, but not of his entire life. Again, he died, he was born in 354 and he died in 430. So this book was written around 400, so he had 30 years left after after this book was written. Then I want to talk about some specific things in the text that you need to understand in terms of context so it makes sense. Specifically, Augustine, he was a Manichaean or Manichae for about 9 years, and basically all of his 20s. So what was that? Why was he that religion? He sort of talks about it in the text, but he kind of assumes that you know what it is because, of course, at that time it's a religion that exists. Whereas today, in the 21st century, it doesn't at least formally exist, although we could argue, as we'll see, intellectually, a lot of Christians are Manichaeans, even if they don't know it. So that's kind of what we want to do today. So, Augustine of Hippo. One of the most important, if not the most important thinkers in the history of Christianity. Other people in that category would be another man from the early church named Origen of Alexandria. And then, of course, St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. In the Protestant world, you have people like John Calvin and Martin Luther as well. He is a doctor of the church. There are, I forgot the exact number, about 33, 34 doctors of the church. He's the doctor of grace, and he gets that title from a controversy that happens after he writes the Confessions. It's called the Pelagian controversy. We'll probably talk about that in the dogmatic theology class. Lives at the end of the Roman Empire, as we talked about last time. He was deeply educated in the Roman way, just like a lot of other early church fathers. One we'll talk about today, Ambrose of Milan, who baptized him. And Augustine, along with Ambrose and others, wanted to make let's call it a Christian literature that rivaled, in fact, was better than the long Greco-Roman tradition that he had inherited. Think of writers like Virgil and Cicero, which he mentions in this text. We'll talk about his youth when he was a child in school and his experiences in school, especially with the Greek language, how he hated that. We have more writings from him than any other author in the history of Christianity from antiquity. And not just Christian authors, but non-Christian authors. So people I mentioned like Virgil and Cicero. So that tells you how important he was. Texts, letters, sermons, not all of his texts have survived, but the vast majority of them have. Certainly a lot of his letters and sermons have not survived, but in terms of his sort of theological treatises, they have survived. So he becomes a Christian, which this book talks about. He is... What this book doesn't really get into is what happens after his conversion. He goes back home to North Africa, and we'll get into the details in this in the coming weeks. Is forcibly ordained to be first a priest and then a bishop. This was a common practice. In fact, most, if not all, of the great early church fathers, like Ambrose, were forcibly ordained. So when you're a young man today and you're discerning the priesthood, you go through a long process, especially here at the seminary. Is God calling me to the priesthood? That's not the way it was in the early church. There was no such thing as seminaries, first of all. So, and oftentimes they were forcibly ordained. By that, I literally mean they were tackled, held down, and forcibly ordained. And Augustine was one of these people. He was initially ordained as a priest. Then when the bishop, he was made a coadjutor bishop along with his Greek-speaking bishop in North Africa. This was a Latin-speaking area, so most people there didn't really know Greek, including Augustine. His Greek was pretty weak. When that bishop dies, Augustine becomes the sole bishop, and so for over 30 years, he's the bishop. And those last 30 years of his life, kind of after the Confessions, it's not exciting in the sense that the book talks about the beginning of his life. Those last 30 years, he never leaves North Africa. He goes back and forth to Carthage a lot, and then he gets into a lot of these theological controversies. He writes some of the most important texts in the history of Christianity. Not just Confessions, which that alone probably would make him famous, but other books like On the City of God and The Trinity, De Trinitate, on the Trinity. It's one of the most important, if not the most important text in the history of Christianity, exploring this question of what do we mean when we say God is a Trinity. I already mentioned the Pelagian controversy that deals with questions of original sin and free will. Any and every aspect of Christian thought, Augustine addressed it. He talked extensively about marriage. His views on marriage and sexuality have been influential down through the centuries. A lot of people sort of blame Augustine for his views on sexuality, although I think it's often misunderstood. They sort of paint him as this sort of grumpy Puritan, which is not true. He simply talks about, yes, sex is good when it's rightly ordered, right? So Augustine's critics then and now often don't even understand what he's saying. The Confessions itself, often considered the first autobiography in Western literature. Although I think that's not entirely accurate, because to say something is an autobiography obviously means it's a text about Augustine. And undoubtedly the text is filled with details about Augustine's life. He does talk extensively about himself. But I think if you were to say to Augustine, this is an autobiography about you, he would find that strange. He would say that this is not a book about himself, that this is a book about God working in his soul, and that how he is and can be an example for how God works in all of our souls. He's sort of a model or an archetypal figure, we might say today. So right from the very first sentence of the book, Augustine is quoting Psalm 47, and he's praying to God. So the first line is, "You are great, Lord, and highly to be praised." Right there from the first sentence, Augustine has our focus on God. It's not on himself. And so it's often described as a prayer. It's a prayer to God. So a prayer, a book about God. And the autobiographical components, though there are many, in his mind would be secondary. And I think we need to adopt that idea of it being secondary. Okay? All right. Just some detail on his young life. Again, I don't want to get into the specifics in this lecture because that's what the text is all about, right? So we'll and our conversation on these first 6 books we're going to talk about here, and then the next video will be books 7, 8, and 9. Okay. So he was born in Tagaste, North Africa. So he was a North African. So one thing I like to say all the time is people always talk about sort of dead white men in Christian literature. Well, Augustine was not a white man. He was not European. He was from North Africa. We know a bit about his father, not very much though, because they clearly did not have a very good relationship. He was not a good man, especially to his wife, St. Monica, which we know a lot about. Here in California, Santa Monica, California, is named for his mother. We know quite a bit about her, which isn't that remarkable to us, but you do have to remember in antiquity, women were not referenced very much in ancient literature. There are exceptions, of course. You can think of someone like Diotima in Plato's Symposium or somebody like that. So we know a lot about his mother. His father was a pagan, we would say, until his deathbed when he sort of was baptized, which I had mentioned last time was a common practice in antiquity. His mother, though, was a devout Christian, and she prayed for him all of his life. And to this day, Monica is often a patron saint for mothers with wayward children, because Augustine, throughout the first 30 years of his life, she would have considered him to be a wayward son. So she comes from a Christian background. Early in her life, it's possible that the family was a Donatist Christian flavor. We might have time to talk about that. That's a sort of schismatic group that in North Africa eventually is forced to become Catholic. And so at some point, her family becomes Catholic. And so she brought her Catholicism to Augustine as a young man. So that Catholicism was always kind of in the back of Augustine's mind. So another thing, we'll talk more about this in detail later, we often talk about Augustine's sort of conversion to Christianity. I think we'll talk about that in the next video. It's a bit more complicated than that, because to say Augustine converted from sort of Manichaeanism to Christianity is not entirely accurate, because this Catholicism was always sort of lurking in the background. These beginning books, we would call them chapters, but when we talk about Augustine's Confessions, we always talk about books. In the beginning books, Augustine talks about his young life, including his education. He loved Latin. He hated Greek. He was forced to learn Greek. At that time in the Roman Empire, the lingua franca of the western half, where Augustine lived, was Latin, and so he would have been speaking that to people. Whereas Greek, that was the lingua franca of the eastern half of the empire, and so Augustine mostly would have just engaged that, certainly as a child, in literature and writing, and so it was harder for him to learn it. He didn't like it, and he has that great story where he talks about suffering at the hands of his teachers because of corporal punishment. He was from the small town, and so they had what we would call primary education, but they didn't have sort of secondary education. So Augustine's father, who was kind of a cad, but he was a good father in the sense that he wanted his son, specifically Augustine, to get a good education. There was Augustine, they had a brother named Navigius, and then a sister that we don't know her name or anything about her. Tradition says that her name was Perpetua, and she becomes what we would call a nun, in fact, an abbess or a mother superior, you might say, later on. We don't really know much about her, though. Augustine was sent to a town called Medauros to continue his education, but his father runs out of money because, of course, there's no public free education. You have to pay for it yourself. And they were what we might call a lower middle class in terms of economics. And his father was a sort of minor political figure in their hometown. So certainly not coming from a rich family or politically important family or going to the greatest schools that the Roman Empire had to offer. None of that applied to Augustine. His father runs out of money when Augustine is maybe about 15 years old. He had to go home, and he was bored, frankly, because he had nothing to do. And there's that great story that we'll talk about in our discussion of him with his friends stealing pigs and throwing them, stealing pears and throwing them at pigs. But then he gets a financial sponsor, possibly a relative, gets to go and continue his education. He goes to Carthage, sort of the big city in North Africa. You can think of sort of Carthage as Chicago in the 19th century. You know, Chicago is a hub, especially when you have the trains at the end of the 19th century, the train system. and farmers would take their animals and their grain to Chicago to be distributed throughout the country through the train system. Carthage was on the ocean, and North Africa was sort of a breadbasket, if you will. And so people would take their grains and their animals to Carthage. So Carthage is kind of one of the second or third most important city in the West in the Roman Empire at the time. So he's going to the big city, about 17 years old, for what we would call college at this point. Again, there was no college system in the Roman Empire at that time. And he sort of gets himself into trouble, as young men often do. We'll have time to talk about that famous scene when he talks about, "I was in love with love." Really a beautiful, powerful scene at the beginning of book 3. It's at this time that he falls in love with a woman. We don't know anything about her, really. We don't know her name. He was really in love with her, devoted to her. He wasn't simply using her sexually. And they had a son named Adeodatus. Augustine was probably about 18. This was not planned. They did not get married because she was probably of a different class from him. Had this son, Adeodatus, which means gift from God, whom Augustine did love deeply, and he died in his teen years. We don't know a lot. We don't know anything about why he died, and we don't know too much about him. Augustine clearly, throughout his entire life, even though he mentions Adeodatus a few times, was deeply wounded by the death of his son, as you can imagine. While Augustine was living in Carthage and studying, and he received what we would call a rhetorical education, that is the study of rhetoric. In antiquity, rhetoric was seen as the highest form of education. Rhetoric is, we don't really generally have it, at least not as a field of study as an end in itself. Rhetoric, you might think of lawyers using rhetoric in the courtroom to convince juries. But rhetoric, for its own end, for its own sake, was the highest form of education. The ability to speak persuasively, cogently, articulately, in an extemporaneous fashion. Okay? So that was the sort of education Augustine received. When he goes to Carthage, he reads a text that doesn't actually exist anymore. It's called Hortensius by Cicero. We have sections of it, large sections of it, but the whole text we don't have anymore. And the reason that text was important for Augustine, it was a philosophical text. And so Augustine sort of falls in love with philosophy, the love of wisdom, the pursuit of truth. And so Augustine becomes enamored with that. So he starts looking for truth. And one of the things that he does to look for truth is he reads the Bible. And he's frankly disappointed in it. He says it pales in comparison to the dignity of Cicero. In other words, Not that Augustine at this point has a problem with the content of the Bible, what it's saying, but we have to admit that rhetorically speaking, most of the Bible is not all that interesting. I mean, there are exceptions like the Psalms, for example, but just think of like the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark is not a beautiful text rhetorically, right? It's just, Jesus went here, he cast out this demon, then he went to this other town, and then he healed this person, then he went over to this other town, and he did some preaching, and then he was killed, right? I mean, it's not an engaging text in a rhetorical way. So Augustine, having that rhetorical education, reads the Bible, and he's like, this is garbage. There's nothing interesting about this. So he dismisses the Bible, and therefore Christianity as sort of lowbrow is what we might call it today. So he's searching for truth, and this is one of the great parts of the entire text, and why this text sort of continues to speak to us today. Is this is what we all do. As I mentioned earlier, we can see this text as sort of Augustine as a model for us, God moving in our lives, and you can see Augustine wrestling with truth, trying to find truth, looking for it in all kinds of different places, and He doesn't find it initially in Christianity, but he ends up finding it for 9 years in a religion called Manichaeism or Manichaeanism. We don't have time to get into the details of it, but but here's some basics. It was a religion. It wasn't totally separate from Christianity. It was, we might call, a cousin of Christianity, because it had Christian elements in it. Jesus was a figure. The Holy Spirit was a figure. Some of the biblical texts were sacred texts for the Manichaeans. It's called Manichaeanism because it was started by a man named Mani, M-A-N-I, who lived 216 to 276, claimed to be an apostle of God, of Jesus Christ. And it's sort of an amalgamation or a syncretism of a variety of different religions, including Christianity. Started in what we would call Iran today, spreads throughout the world, goes to China, in fact, and makes it over to North Africa by the time Augustine is a young man. It actually arrived in 297. Missionaries arrived in Carthage. Some of the fundamental theological points of Manichaeanism, first of all, is we Christians say we believe in one God, but Manichaeans said, no, there are two gods. There's a good God and an evil God, and that these two gods are sort of constantly fighting it out, right? It's sort of an eternal battle or war that's being waged between the two of them. And anything that is material, anything that is bodily, anything that's fleshly, is a product or a creation of this evil God. Whereas anything that's sort of spirit or light, anything that has no materiality, that's a product of this good God. And that that we human beings, because we are a combination of body and soul, we're sort of a product or creation of both of those gods. And so the Manichaeans saw the body as evil, whereas the soul is good, and we want to sort of liberate, you could say, the soul. So because the body is evil, that means certain activities like eating meat is evil, sex is evil, marriage is evil, because marriage, of course, leads to sex, which leads to procreation. So all of these things are evil. Augustine becomes a Manichaean, but there are sort of two levels of Manichaeans. The sort of lower level that has fewer expectations or requirements, we call them the hearers, the auditors, people who hear. They listen to the sort of public teaching. There was a secret teaching, supposedly, of what the Manichaeans really believed. But you can hear and assist the higher group, which is called the elect. And the elect, they're the ones that had the more rigorous expectations, like you have to eat things like watermelon, because, again, watermelon compared to meat has less mass to it. It's not as dense. They had to be, they could not drink alcohol. Alcohol was seen as evil. Did not get married, did not have sex. So Augustine never became an elect, never became that higher level. He was always a hearer, which is how and why he was able to have sex with that unnamed woman, be in that relationship with her, have a son, and never made it to that next level. Now, why was Augustine attracted to this religion? And the answer is, one of the questions that he, and I think a lot of us have, is we sort of get obsessed with one or maybe two questions, big questions, that haunt us for our entire lives. And one question that haunted Augustine his entire life was the question of evil, right? A classic philosophical question. Where does evil come from? And the Manichaeans offered an answer to that question, which I've already told you, that there are two gods. So for a time, about 9 years, that satisfied Augustine. And so he was a part of this Manichaean religion. He was a hearer in that religion. Finishes what we would call college, goes back home to teach, and his mother will not let him in the house. His father has probably died by this point, because he's a Manichaean. Augustine's a Manichaean at this point, and Monica is a good, faithful Catholic woman. So he shows up, and she will not let him in the house. And he stays there for a time. but then goes back to Carthage again to teach. And he is absolutely horrified by teaching. There's this great story, hopefully we'll have time to talk about it in our discussion, that you read of Augustine teaching these children, and they're just vandalic. They're violent, they're disruptive. And so he says, I can't stand this, as a lot of teachers do. And so he ends up leaving. He goes up to Rome, and he thinks he's going to Rome to be a teacher to better students, right? He has this sort of romantic vision in his mind. Oh, if only I could get to the center of the capital of the Roman Empire of the West. And we already talked about Constantinople was now the seat of the Roman Empire for the whole thing. But Rome still has this attraction to it, and it's still important in the West. So he goes to Rome thinking, oh, this is going to be so much better. And in fact, it's worse. They're not as sort of violent as the students in North Africa. But one of the things that they do is, and this has always confused me, is they don't do like we do in terms of having to pay your tuition at what we would say at the beginning of the semester or the term. For whatever reason, you would pay at the end of the term or the semester. And so what would happen is these students would sit at Augustine's feet for the whole term, and then right before the end of the term, they would transfer to some other teacher, and they wouldn't pay Augustine, right? So these sort of romantic visions of teaching, he has a cold dash of reality that no, the students in Rome, in fact, are worse than the students in North Africa. Augustine gets a job invitation up in Milan, which actually, even though Rome still has an authority to it, a weight to it, an importance to it, the emperor of the West, we're now at this point back to having two emperors, he is in Milan. And so Augustine goes, and he becomes, there's not really a position in our government today, but it's sort of, I don't know, I guess you might call it the head speechwriter or something like that, or the head propagandist, right? His job is to write what's called panegyrics to the emperor, about the emperor, singing the emperor's praises. So he goes to Milan, and he's starting to become dissatisfied with Manichaeanism. Confessions talk about sort of how he's trying to pursue truth. He talks to this Manichaean named Faustus, trying to get some deeper answers, and that Faustus basically failed him in giving him satisfactory answers. So Augustine at this point is starting to become disenfranchised or disaffected with the Manichaeans, but he doesn't quite know what to do. While he's in Milan, he hears about this guy named Ambrose, who's Saint Ambrose of Milan. This is one of the few times in Christian history where two of the great figures not only lived at the same time, but they knew each other, although they were never really friends, and we don't have any letter correspondence between the two of them. Ambrose was forcibly ordained. In fact, when he was forcibly proclaimed to be the bishop, he went straight to becoming the bishop. He was not even a Christian. He had not been baptized yet. So he was proclaimed as the bishop. They had to sort of quickly baptize him, and then they sort of formally made him the bishop. And the reason why is because he was a beloved figure in Milan, highly respected by everybody. So Augustine hears about this guy, and Augustine, we would call him as sort of, what's the word? I guess we could say he was an elitist, really. He was an elitist. So he hears about Ambrose, and he hears about this man's reputation, that he's a good rhetorician, he's a good speaker, and in this case, a good preacher. So Augustine wants to go and check this guy out. Does he have all these sort of, does his reputation really... is it legitimate? Is the reality of Ambrose meeting up with that reputation? So he goes to hear Ambrose preach. And he is quite impressed with his rhetoric, with Ambrose's rhetoric. But he says in the Confessions that the content of the Catholic faith that Ambrose was preaching sort of crept in the back door. He wasn't expecting it. And there's a couple of things that shocked Augustine or radically reoriented his thinking that sort of opened the door to Christianity. And the first is that biblical interpretation. Remember I mentioned earlier that Augustine had read the Bible as a young man, and he was put off by it because it's not rhetorically all that impressive. Here we are, flash forward, Augustine's now about 30 years old, listening to Ambrose preach, and he realizes Augustine, has not been interpreting the Bible correctly. That there's good ways to interpret it, and there are bad ways to interpret it. And Augustine did not understand that, and he did not understand that he had been misinterpreting or misreading the Bible. Specifically, the idea of the spirit and the letter, which hopefully we'll have time to talk about in our conversation, and that there's a sort of deeper level, ways of interpreting the Bible, that you have this sort of literal level, and then there's this sort of spiritual or figurative level that teaches deeper truths. Augustine didn't understand that until he listened to Ambrose. And one specific example, and this gets to our second point, is Ambrose made Augustine realize that God did not have a body. Because Augustine came from the Manichaean background, he thought of everything as corporeal. Everything had a body. Nothing could be pure spirit. And so therefore, even God would have had a body. But Augustine came to understand that no, God does not have a body. And when you read things in the Old Testament, for example, that sort of talk about the fist or the hand of God, Augustine had been reading that or understood that literally, that God physically had a hand. He had a body. Ambrose helped him realize, no, that God doesn't have a body, but you have to think about it on that figurative or spiritual level. That to talk about God's fist or God's hand is to talk about God's power, God's might. So Augustine was sort of knocked over by Ambrose, understanding, oh, wait a minute, I haven't been reading the Bible correctly. So this sort of opens the door a bit more for his ability to what we'll call conversion, although we'll talk later about how that's not exactly accurate. One more thing for our conversation today, and then we will finish up in our next video on that conversion. How exactly does Augustine become a Christian? So as I said, Augustine had become sort of disaffected or disenfranchised with Manichaeanism. He meets Ambrose. Ambrose and Augustine's mother, Monica, she had actually followed him. They entered into what we call a spiritual relationship. Ambrose became a spiritual father to Monica. She was very devoted to him, and Ambrose said some very positive things to Augustine about his mother. Augustine and Ambrose were never really close, probably because Augustine was a Manichaean at that time. And then shortly after Augustine is baptized, they go back to North Africa. So they never got to know each other when Augustine was a Christian. And this is, I think, a great loss to Christian history. Sort of one of these alternative realities. What if Augustine had stayed in Milan as a Christian for years and the two of them developed a friendship? Or at the very least, if they had had a letter correspondence. Ambrose died at the end of the 4th century, so Augustine had been a Christian for about 10 years, but again, because they hadn't really gotten a personal relationship when Augustine was in Milan, we have no letter correspondence back and forth from North Africa to Milan for those 10 years before Ambrose dies. So again, Augustine at this point, he's in his early 30s, not happy with Manichaeanism, being challenged by Ambrose of Milan, still searching for truth in Manichaeanism, in philosophy, in sex, in his relationships, right? He's grasping for it in a variety of different ways, and all of these modes of truth, of conveying truth to him, all fail to him. They don't seem ultimately satisfactory to him. So he has what we might call an existential crisis, and he gives up his Manichaean religion, and he becomes what we would call a skeptic. Now, we use this word skeptic in sort of everyday language, right? That I say I'm skeptical of this or I'm skeptical of that. But skepticism was and is to this day a school of philosophy. There are skeptics running around these days, but not as many as there used to be. It was a school of philosophy, a Greek school of thought. And the idea is that it's open to the possibility of anything being true, and in fact, everything being true. One of the great theologians or philosophers of skepticism was a man named Sextus Empiricus. And we don't know a lot about him. He didn't come up with this, but he's kind of like the Augustine of skepticism. He's sort of one of the great articulators of skepticism. So what skepticism does is that, let me just read a couple of quotations to you from Sextus Empiricus. He says, "Skepticism is an ability to place in antithesis in any manner whatever appearances and judgments, and thus, because of the equality of force in the objects and argument opposed, to come first of all to a suspension of judgment and then mental tranquility." All right, what does that mean? Let's say you got two religions or two philosophies, or just think of atheism. All right, so let's say you've got Christianity on one hand and you've got atheism on the other, making very opposite claims. Christianity says there's a God, atheism says there's no God. And you explore them and you put them in conversation with each other. And what you find is, well, the best thinkers in both of those traditions really make compelling arguments. There might be a God, there might be no God. Which is true? Well, because you can't figure out, and they might, either one of those might be true, what you do as a skeptic is suspend your judgment, right? I'm not going to judge. I'm not going to say, yes, Christianity is right, or yes, atheism is right. I'm going to step back, and I'm not going to make any claims about truth here. And what the skeptic says, at least in theory or in hope, is in the suspension of that judgment, you will have, as we saw there from Sextus Empiricus, mental tranquility. That Augustine was, as I said, wrestling with truth, trying to find it in philosophy, trying to find it in Manichaeanism. There's this restlessness in him. And there's that great line from the very beginning of Augustine's Confessions when he talks about our restless hearts. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. So Augustine is a restless young man, and he finds in skepticism for a couple of years, he doesn't stay too long as a skeptic, this idea of finding rest or mental tranquility. When I suspend my judgment and I don't say the Manichaeans are right or the Christians are right or this group is right or that group is right, then in theory I will become tranquil, right? And not only that I'll become tranquil, but I will cease to dogmatize. So let me read this second quote to you from Sextus Empiricus. "The principal fundamental of the existence of skepticism is this proposition. To every argument, an equal argument is opposed, for we believe that it is in the consequence of this principle that we are brought to a point where we cease to dogmatize." We cease to dogmatize. What does that mean? That if I'm a Christian or I'm an atheist, that I sort of feel compelled to go and tell you, this is the truth and you need to believe it. And of course, we know from the history of civilization, there have been a lot of wars fought in the name of religion, right? I'm right, you're wrong. I need to convince you, and if I can't convince you, well, I will kill you in war. You've never heard of a war that's been fought in the name of skepticism, because there's this idea that once you find this mental tranquility, you will cease to dogmatize, because you're not saying this is right and this is wrong. So that is also another level of appeal, that people aren't dogmatizing because of skepticism. They're not engaging in violence, forcing you to believe this religion. So Augustine becomes a skeptic, right? And it's kind of I like to call it a sort of temper tantrum. Augustine's in his early 30s. He's been searching for truth for 15 years at this point. He doesn't find it, and it's sort of like, well, I haven't found truth yet, so I'm going to take my ball and go home because I didn't get what I wanted, right? He had expected by this point in his life he would have found truth, and he hasn't found it. So he sort of gives up, becomes a skeptic, and like I said, he kind of takes his ball and he goes home. And he hopes and he thinks that this skepticism for a short time is going to give him that mental tranquility that he hopes for. That doesn't happen. And in fact, when Augustine does become a Christian, the first text that he writes as a Christian, not one of his more famous ones, it's called Against the Skeptics or Against the Academics. This is another term for skeptics. So he's a young man in his early 30s at this point. Frankly, doesn't know a lot about Christianity yet, but he's sort of struggling with learning about it. And he writes this short text, which we still have. You can buy it and read it. Not one of his greatest works, but it is important. One of his important works because it was written so early in his life. It gives us an insight into his life. In fact, actually, he wasn't even baptized at that point. We'll talk about this next week, but he has a sort of existential crisis, commits to wanting to become a Christian kind of in the summer of 386, doesn't get baptized till Easter of 387. So you've got about 9 months there where he wants to become a Christian. He's going through the process, but he's not yet baptized. So in fact, Against the Skeptics was written before he was technically a Christian because he wasn't even baptized yet. We talked about baptism last week with Constantine. Okay, the importance of the entrance into Christianity is, of course, baptism. So there is Augustine now as a skeptic, rejecting Manichaeanism, being sort of enticed by Ambrose to think differently, but he is a skeptic. We're going to stop there because we've got one more week with Augustine, and we're going to get into this next week. How does Augustine eventually get from skepticism to his baptism and then the rest of his life? So that's where we will finish up next week.